A coffee cup exploded against the kitchen wall. Hot coffee ran down the wood and pooled on the floor. A little girl froze in the doorway, her small hands pressed over her ears. A man stood by the counter, chest heaving, his fists shaking at his sides. He hadn't meant to throw it. He never meant to. But the silence in that house was total, and some mornings it pressed down harder than a man could stand. 12 years he'd carried it. 12 years since he'd laughed, since he'd smiled, since anything warm had lived under that roof. His name was Duke Callahan, and folks around the valley called him the coldest man on the hill. The girl in the doorway was his daughter, and she was already backing away. What would it take to thaw a man who hadn't smiled in 12 years? Stay with me on this one. Duke didn't clean up the broken cup. He grabbed his coat off the hook and walked out to the barn, and he let the cold do what it always did, which was nothing at all. He stood in the middle of his cattle and breathed and waited for the knot in his chest to loosen. It never loosened. 12 winters of that. 12 winters of a big man walking his own land like a ghost who'd forgotten he was dead. His wife was Ruth. She'd been gone since the year their daughter turned 2. A fever took her over 3 fast days, and by the 4th day the house went quiet, and it stayed quiet. Duke buried her on the hill above the creek and came back down and never sang again, never whistled, never told a joke at the feed store. People stopped inviting him to things. After a while, people stopped talking to him much at all. The girl was Emmy. She was 14 now, and here's the thing you need to understand about Emmy. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in years, not because she couldn't. Because somewhere along the line she'd learned that words fell into that silent house and disappeared, and a child stops throwing things into a hole once she sees they never come back. She moved through the rooms like her father did. 2 ghosts and a dog. The dog was Biscuit, an old cattle dog with a gray muzzle and a bad hip, and a deep suspicion of every living creature that wasn't Duke or Emmy. Biscuit hadn't let a stranger pass the porch steps in years. He'd plant himself on the top board and show his teeth, and that was usually enough to send folks back to their trucks. Duke never called him off. Truth be told, Duke liked that the dog kept people away. It saved him the trouble, but the ranch was slipping. Duke couldn't run the cattle, work the hay, and raise a silent girl all at once. He'd tried. He was failing at the last part worst of all. So one week in late autumn, he did something that cost him more pride than he'd admit. He drove into Kalispell and put an advertisement in the paper. Live in Nanny and housekeeper wanted. Hill Ranch, hard work, no nonsense. 14 people read that ad, not one of them called, except one. She arrived on a gray afternoon in a rattling old sedan, and Duke watched her from the porch and already knew what the town would say. Marla Rhodes was a big woman, wide through the shoulders and the hips, the kind of woman men at the feed store called names behind their coffee. She climbed out of that car in a flowered dress and sensible boots, and she stood there looking up at the house like she was measuring it. Biscuit came off the porch stiff-legged, growling low. Marla looked down at the dog. She didn't back up. She didn't reach for him either. She just stopped where she was and let him do his sniffing and his snarling, and she said in a plain, warm voice, "All right, you take your time." Duke came down the steps. "Dog bites." "Then I'll heal," Marla said. She smiled at him. He didn't smile back. He never did. He told her the terms: room off the kitchen, cook clean, mind the girl. He told her the girl didn't talk and there was no fixing that, so she needn't try. He told her the pay, which wasn't much. And then, because he was an honest man even when it wasn't kind, he told her the truth. "Half this valley thinks you won't last a week up here. For what it's worth, I think they're right." Marla picked up her one suitcase. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've outlasted worse than a cold house and a rude man." And she walked past him up the steps and into the kitchen, and she stopped at the sight of the broken cup and the dried coffee still on the floor from that morning. She didn't ask about it. She set down her suitcase, found a rag, got down on her knees and cleaned it up. Duke stood in the doorway and watched her do it and felt something he couldn't name, something almost like shame, and he turned and walked back out to the cattle. That first night, nobody ate together. Marla made supper and set it out, and Duke took his plate to the barn office like always, and Emmy carried hers up to her room. Marla ate alone at the big table with the old dog watching her from the far corner, still not trusting, and she talked to that dog the whole meal in a low, easy voice about nothing at all. The weather, the drive up, a sister she'd lost. By the time she washed her plate, Biscuit had crept 3 feet closer, just 3 feet, but he'd moved. The town's warnings weren't idle. This was hard hill country outside Kalispell, and the woman had no ranch in her, that much was plain. But what the town didn't count on was that Marla Rhodes had buried her own people, every one of them, and she knew grief the way Duke knew cattle. She recognized this house the second she stepped in it. She'd lived in one just like it. She knew you didn't shout the silence out of a place. You baked it out. You sang it out. You outlasted it. And she had nothing left to lose and nowhere else to be. So a cold man and a mute girl and a mean old dog didn't scare her one bit. By morning she was up before the sun with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the kitchen smelled like bread. Now, you have to know what that smell did in that house. Duke came in from the milking and stopped dead in the doorway. Warm bread. He hadn't smelled bread rising in that kitchen since Ruth. For 1/2 of 1 second before he caught himself, his hand went to the doorframe like his knees had gone soft. Then his jaw locked back up and he sat down and ate the 2 slices she set in front of him without a word. But he ate them, and Marla saw that he ate them. She didn't say anything either. She'd learned that a man like this, you didn't spook him with kindness. You just left it on the table where he could reach it. Emmy wouldn't come down. Marla carried a warm heel of bread up the stairs and set it outside the girl's door on a little plate with butter melting into it, and she knocked once and said, "That's yours if you want it, honey. No trouble either way." Then she went back down. An hour later the plate was empty. Marla washed it and said nothing. This is how she worked, slow, steady, never pushing. She left bread for the girl every morning and the plate always came back empty. She talked to Biscuit until the old dog started following her from room to room. And she moved through Duke's cold house, filling it up, inch by inch, with the smell of yeast and the sound of a low voice humming. And nobody could have told you the exact day it happened. But the house started to feel a little less like a grave. It took her 9 days to get Emmy down the stairs in daylight. She did it with a bowl of dough. She was kneading at the counter and she said out loud to no one, "My hands are getting tired. Sure could use a second pair." She didn't look at the stairs. She kept her eyes down and kept working. And after a long while there were small footsteps, and a girl with her mother's eyes stood at the bottom of the stairs, and Marla slid the bowl 6 inches down the counter and kept kneading her own and never once looked over. Emmy pushed her fingers into the dough, and for the first time in longer than Duke could remember, his daughter was doing a thing in the daylight instead of hiding from it. Outside was harder. The girl hadn't willingly gone outside for anything but the school bus in a year, but Marla had a trick for that too. She let Biscuit do the work. The old dog trusted her now, followed her everywhere, and where the dog went, the girl's eyes went. And one frosty afternoon, Marla clipped a lead on Biscuit and said, "He needs a walk and I'm too slow. Would you take him to the fence and back?" And she held out the lead and she waited and Emmy took it. Duke watched from the loft as his daughter walked his old dog across the frozen yard to the fence and back, her breath fogging in the cold, and he had to sit down on a hay bale and put his face in his hands. He didn't understand what was happening to him. That was the truth of it. Every warm thing that woman brought into his house felt like a hand pressing on a bruise. It hurt. It hurt because it woke up the part of him that had gone numb, and the numbness had been mercy. He'd built his whole life around not feeling this, and now there was bread on the table and a girl walking a dog and a big, kind woman humming in Ruth's kitchen, and he didn't know whether to thank her or beg her to stop. So he did neither. He went colder. He barked at her about the woodpile. He told her the bread was a waste of flour. He told her not to fill the girl's head. Marla took every bit of it standing still, and when he was done she said, "You finished." And when he didn't answer she said, "Good. Supper's at 6," and went back to work. She never once fought him. You cannot freeze a fire that refuses to argue with you. The weeks rolled toward deep winter. Emmy started leaving her door open. She started sitting at the table for supper, still not talking, but there. And one night when Marla set down the bread, Emmy looked up at her and made a small sound, and it was the start of a word, the very front of one, and then she stopped, scared of her own voice. Marla just nodded like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "I hear you, honey," she said softly. "There's no hurry." Then came the morning that broke something open. It was frostbitten and bright, the kind of Montana cold that makes the whole valley ring like glass. Duke came in early from the north pasture, stamping snow off his boots, and he heard something coming from the parlor that stopped his heart flat in his chest. Music. An old record, one of Ruth's, one he thought he'd packed away years ago. And under the music another sound, laughing. A child laughing. His child. He came around the corner and there they were. Marla had the parlor rug pushed back and she was dancing. This big woman spinning slow and graceful with Emmy's hands in hers. And Emmy was laughing, really laughing, her head thrown back. And old Biscuit was up on his bad hip barking and turning circles around the two of them like a pup. And the whole cold room was full of light and noise and life. Duke stood in the doorway and could not breathe. 12 years. 12 years of that room being a place he walked through fast with his eyes down. And now his daughter was dancing in it. Ruth's daughter, Ruth's music. And something in his chest, something that had been frozen so long he'd forgotten it was even a part of him, cracked clean down the middle. His eyes filled. His throat closed. He gripped the door frame. Marla saw him first. She slowed, but she didn't stop. She just turned Emmy gently by the hands until the girl was facing her father, and Emmy saw him standing there. And for one terrible second Duke was sure the laughing would die, that the girl would go still and small the way she always did when he came in a room. But she didn't. She looked at her father, cheeks pink from spinning, and she smiled at him. And she said one word. The first word she'd said to him in years. "Daddy." Duke made a sound that wasn't a word at all. He crossed that room in 3 steps and dropped to his knees on the pushed-back rug and pulled his daughter against his chest. And this big, hard, silent man held on to her and shook, and the old record played on, and Marla stepped back quiet against the wall and let a father have his girl. If this story is reaching something in you, if you know what it is to lose the sound of your own house, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there's more to this, and the next part is the part I really need you to hear, because it did not stay this good. It couldn't. Not with what was already driving up the hill. Duke had a brother-in-law once, sort of. Ruth's older sister, Vivian, lived down in Bozeman, and she'd never thought much of Duke Callahan. She'd wanted Ruth to marry a lawyer, not a rancher, and when Ruth died, Vivian had put half of it on Duke somehow, the way grieving people do. For 12 years she'd sent Emmy a birthday card and nothing else. But somebody in the valley, some good Christian neighbor with a wagging tongue, had gotten word to Vivian that Duke Callahan had thrown a coffee cup across his kitchen with the child right there, and that he'd hired a housekeeper of a certain size to raise the girl, and that the whole arrangement was a scandal and a danger. So on the very afternoon that Emmy said Daddy for the first time in years, a cream-colored car came up the frozen drive, and a thin, sharp woman in a good coat got out with a leather folder under her arm, and she walked straight past Biscuits growling like the dog wasn't there. She'd brought a man with her too, quiet county badge, a caseworker. Vivian climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door she'd never once visited, and when Duke opened it she held up the folder and said, "I've filed for custody of my sister's daughter. This is a formal notice. That child is not safe in this house, and I intend to prove it." Duke's hands went cold. The warmth that had just cracked open in him 12 minutes earlier turned to ice-water dread. Because here's the thing about a man like Duke. He knew his own record. He knew what it looked like from the outside. A cold widower, a mute child, a thrown cup, a house that had been more tomb than home for over a decade. He'd handed this woman her whole case himself, one silent year at a time. And now she stood on his porch ready to take the only living piece of Ruth he had left. The caseworker was polite, and it was worse for being polite. He stepped inside, notebook out, and he looked around the kitchen, and he asked Duke how often he raised his voice and had he ever broken things, and how long the child had gone without speaking, and did Duke understand that a mute child was often a sign of a fearful home. Every question landed like a stone, and Duke, God help him, went silent. The old habit. The frozen jaw. When it mattered most, when he needed to fight for his daughter with words, the years of silence closed his throat like a fist, and he stood there in his own kitchen unable to speak while a stranger wrote down that the father was cold and unresponsive. Vivian smiled thin. "You see," she said to the caseworker, "this is exactly what I mean." It was Marla who stepped forward. Marla, who they hadn't even bothered to look at except to note her size in a way that made Vivian's mouth curl. Marla wiped her hands on her apron and she said, calm as Sunday, "Sir, if you're writing down what you see, then write down the whole of it. Write down that child was dancing in that parlor not 1 hour ago. Write down she said her first word in years to her father this very afternoon. Write down that there's fresh bread on that counter and a warm fire in that stove. And ask yourself when the last time was you walked into a house that smelled this much like a home." The caseworker looked at her. Vivian's eyes went hard. "And who exactly are you?" "The hired help," Marla said without one drop of shame. "The one who's been here. Where were you?" That landed. You could see it land. But Vivian had lawyers and a good coat and a folder full of the truth about Duke's silent years, and Marla had a flowered dress and a job that paid next to nothing, and everyone in that kitchen knew how it would look in front of a judge. The caseworker closed his notebook and said there'd be a hearing in 2 weeks, and that in the meantime the county would be watching, and that if anything at all happened, any raised voice, any broken dish, the child could be removed on the spot. Then they left. The cream car went back down the hill, and the warmth that had lived in that house for one single afternoon went out like a snuffed candle. Duke sat down at the table and stared at the wood. "They're going to take her," he said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken all day. "They're going to take her, and it'll be my own fault. 12 years I was a stone. I built this. I built the case against myself." Marla sat down across from him. Biscuit put his gray head on her knee. And she said something that Duke would carry the rest of his life. She said, "Duke Callahan, you listen to me now. You didn't freeze because you're a bad man. You froze because you loved her so hard that when she went, you thought staying frozen was how you stayed loyal to her. You've been mourning Ruth for 12 years so nobody could ever say you forgot her. But you did forget something. You forgot to raise the piece of her she left you. That's the only sin here, and it's a sin you can still fix. Ruth is not in the silence, Duke. She never was. She's in that girl's laugh. She's been trying to reach you through that child for 12 years, and you kept the door shut because you thought opening it would let her go." Her voice dropped low and steady. "It won't let her go. It'll bring her back. That's the thing about the ones we lose. We don't keep them by going cold. We keep them by staying warm." Duke put his face in his hands and wept at his own kitchen table, and this time he didn't fight it, and Marla reached across and put her broad, warm hand over his big, rough one and let him. Upstairs, a girl who had learned to listen at doors heard her father cry for the first time, and instead of hiding, she came halfway down the stairs and sat and she listened, and she understood more than any of them knew. The next 2 weeks, Duke Callahan did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He tried. He came in for supper and sat at the table with them every night. He asked Emmy about her day, and he waited patient, while she found the courage for small words, and every word she gave him he treated like gold. He fixed the porch step. He let Biscuit sleep inside. He put Ruth's record back on the shelf where they could reach it, and one evening he asked Marla to play it, and he sat in the parlor and listened to the whole thing with his eyes closed and his daughter tucked under his arm, and when it ended he didn't feel Ruth leaving. He felt her sitting right there with them. Marla had been right about that too, but the hearing was coming and the truth of the paperwork hadn't changed. On the morning of it, Duke put on the one good shirt he owned, the one he'd been married in, and he stood in the kitchen shaking. And Emmy came down the stairs in her best dress, and she walked up to her father and took his big hand in both of hers, and she looked up at him and said, clear as a bell, the most words she'd said at once in years. "I'm going to tell them. I'm going to tell them about you. Don't be scared, Daddy. I'm not scared anymore." They drove down to Kalispell together, all 3 of them, with Biscuit's nose fogging the back window. And in that Plain County courtroom, Vivian's lawyer laid it all out, the cold years, the thrown cup, the silence, and it sounded every bit as bad as Duke had feared. The judge, an old man with tired eyes, listened and looked over the top of his glasses at Duke Callahan, and Duke stood up to speak and felt the old ice close his throat again. 12 years of silence rising up to sink him at the last, and then a small voice said, "Can I talk?" The whole room turned. Emmy stood up. The judge, surprised, said she could, and this girl who hadn't spoken in years stood in a courtroom full of strangers and spoke for her father. "My mama died when I was little," she said, "and my daddy got so sad he stopped talking, and I thought it was because he didn't love me, so I stopped talking too. For a long time our house was real quiet," she swallowed, "but it isn't quiet anymore. Marla came and taught us how to be a family again, and my daddy laughs now and he tucks me in and he lets the dog inside, and last week he danced with me in the parlor to my mama's record." She turned to Vivian and there was no meanness in it, only truth. "You want to take me somewhere safe, but I already am safe. I'm safe with my daddy. He was just frozen for a while, and now he's not." She looked back at the judge. "Please don't take me away from the only home I've got. We just now got warm." Nobody in that courtroom said a word. Vivian's lawyer sat down slow. The old judge took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. Then he looked at Duke, and he looked at that girl holding her father's hand, and he looked at the big woman in the flowered dress sitting behind them with her chin high, and he made his ruling. The child would stay with her father. Case dismissed. And he added, quiet off the record, that in 30 years on the bench he'd rarely heard a house described as warm by a child who'd known it cold, and that was worth more to him than any folder full of paper. Duke Callahan turned around in that courtroom and looked at Marla Rhodes, and for the first time in 12 years, in front of God and the county and everybody, this hard, frozen man smiled. It broke across his weathered face like sun coming up over the hill, and once it started he couldn't stop it, and he was smiling and crying both at once, and he reached back and pulled Marla up out of her seat and held on to her like she was the only solid thing in the world, which, for a good long while, she had been. They drove home up the frozen hill, the 3 of them and the dog, and the mountains were pink with evening and nobody spoke, but it was a different kind of quiet now, the good kind. The kind that comes after, not the kind that comes instead. That night Duke tucked Emmy in and sat on the edge of her bed longer than he needed to, and when she was asleep, he came down and found Marla in the kitchen wrapping the last of the bread. He stood in the doorway a while, the same doorway where he'd stood watching her clean up his broken cup on the first day. "Vivian was right about one thing," he said. "You didn't belong up here. Half this valley bet you wouldn't last a week." Marla smiled, "And here I am." "Here you are." Duke came into the kitchen. He was a man who'd spent 12 years with nothing to say, and now the words came slow, but they came. "I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. I forgot how a long time ago. But I know I don't want you driving back down that hill in that rattling car. Not ever. This is your home now, if you'll have it, if you'll have us." Marla looked at this big man, softened now, thawed all the way through, and her eyes went bright. "I've been burying people my whole life, Duke. My folks, my sister. I came up this hill because I had nowhere warm left to go." She reached out and touched his rough cheek. "I'd very much like to stay in a warm house for once." He covered her hand with his. And down the hall, old Biscuit thumped his tail against the floorboards in his sleep. They married in the spring up on the hill by the creek, near where Ruth was laid to rest, because Marla said Ruth ought to be able to see it, and Duke understood that she was right about that the way she'd been right about everything. Emmy stood between them and held both their hands. She talked plenty now, so much that Duke would laugh and say the house had swung clear the other way from too quiet to too loud, and he thanked God for the noise every single day. The ranch came back around. Turned out a house that laughs runs better than a house that grieves. Duke sang out in the pasture now, badly, and Emmy would groan and cover her ears, but she was smiling when she did it. The parlor rug stayed pushed back against the wall most days, because you never knew when a record would go on and a girl would grab her father's hands and pull him up to dance. And that broken coffee cup, the one from that first cold Tuesday morning. Marla had saved the pieces. She'd never said why. One evening near the end of that first winter, Duke found she'd glued it back together and set it on the windowsill over the sink where the morning light hit it. You could still see every crack. She'd made no attempt to hide them. When he asked her about it, she said, "A thing that's been broken and mended holds more than a thing that never broke at all. Those cracks are where the light gets in." And Duke looked at that mended cup catching the sun, and he thought about a frozen man who cracked clean down the middle in his own parlor one frostbitten morning, and he understood exactly what she meant. Duke Callahan hadn't smiled in 12 years. And then a big kind woman in a flowered dress climbed a hard hill that everyone swore would break her, and she baked bread in a dead quiet kitchen, and she coaxed a mute girl out into the daylight, and she won over a mean old dog who hadn't trusted a stranger in years. And she thought a man the whole valley had given up on. That's the whole of it. That's the story. Some houses go cold, believe me, and stay cold a long time. But a cold house isn't a dead house. It's just a house waiting on the right kind of warmth to come walking up the hill. And sometimes, if you're lucky, and if you leave the door open just a crack, it does.